Are you wondering why VCs keep rejecting your pitch deck, no matter how hard you work on it? Because I reviewed over 3,000 decks as a VC, and I've seen founders miss out on funding just because of four common mistakes they do in their pitch deck. So in this video, I'm going to show you exactly what they are and how you can avoid them to finally get those investor meetings, even if you're a beginner. When I was a VC, I was bombarded with pitch decks all the time, and I didn't have enough time to actually look at every single pitch deck for 5 minutes at a time. And you've got to realize that when you're looking at what you're doing with your pitch deck, it's not you that's looking at it, it's someone else. And those investors, they don't have a lot of time to be looking at your pitch deck. And to be honest with you, most of them sucked as well. So I can tell you, most of the investors, especially the more experienced investors, they do something called the flick test. And what the flick test is they open your deck, they flick through the pitch deck very quickly to see if they want to spend more time with you. And if you don't connect with them in the first 10 to 30 seconds, when they're flicking through your pitch deck, they're not going to spend the average of 2 minutes that people say they spend on your pitch deck. They'll spend less than 30 seconds and instantly reject you. So when you're thinking about your pitch deck, you've got to be thinking about how an investor sees it, rather than you spend all of this time thinking about it with your knowledge of your industry. And these four mistakes will guarantee that you fail that test every time. So let's get into what they are. And that first mistake I see founders make, and honestly, this is the one that kills you before you even get a chance, and that's getting the hook wrong when it comes to your pitch deck. Because from what I've seen is that founders just obsess over the wrong parts of the deck. And a big part of that is because you're just constantly getting feedback from people to tell you what to do at the later stages of your deck. You know, someone tells you to add a financial model, or, oh, actually, no, I think you should have the competition slide up higher, or maybe more detail here, or more detail there. And you spend weeks perfecting these slides that, to be honest with you, don't really matter because you've not focused on the slides that make someone want to look at those slides. Because the reality is that, from my experience as a VC, the first three slides are what decide everything. And if they don't make the investor want to spend more time with you when they're flick testing, you've lost them. And they're not going to spend time on this really pretty looking competitive slide that you've tried to make. It's just not happened. So you've lost them before you've got to those slides that matter because you've not been able to connect with them to make them want to spend more time with you. Now think about it if someone, tells you a story. If they start with all of the boring context and background, you're just going to zone out. But if they hook you in from that first line and you feel connected and you're leaning in and you want to hear more, well, then you're willing to give them a little bit more time. And a pitch deck is the exact same thing. They're looking at all of these different stories constantly. I was looking at 20, 30 decks a week, and most of them sucked. And I was bored when I was doing it, to be frank. And it was the ones that hooked me in that earned my attention. And it's going to be the same for you. You need to have a hook that actually earns the investor's attention for the rest of the deck. Because without that, nothing else matters. They're not going to spend time on everything else. They're just going to flick through. They're going to spend 10 to 20 seconds on you, so decide, I don't think this is good enough, and then say no to you. But how to do this yourself? I want to show you some examples of the pitch deck. I'm just going to show you what it is, right? So this is a generic pitch deck, okay? So you've got this deal sync here. So you've got your one-liner here. And then all you're doing is you've got this problem. You just say, oh, I've got the problem. And you've got all of these bullet points that don't really matter at all. And you can see that they've not really spent a lot of time on this. Then they go to solution, and it's the most generic thing in the world. And you can see that this person has just basically taken a cookie cutter deck and they've just decided to put all of their information in and not spend time on, okay, if someone reads this, is someone hooked into the beginning? Is someone actually going to be connected and want to spend more time on this? Whereas if we use the same imaginary company, but we change their deck, you can see here, right? This is not just a one-liner that doesn't really do anything, or the problem. You don't just say the problem, right? You literally say 68% of B2B churn starts before the customer even onboards. That makes me lean in. That makes me want to spend more time with you. This is the hook that makes me say, wow, okay, what's the next step? What's the next step, right? And then you say, and the problem is only just got 10 times worse. You're like, wow, really? Oh my God, wow. So it was horrendously bad, and then it got 10 times worse. Oh my God, well, how is this going to be solved? And then you can say, and then we cut this. Hopefully you can see that when you do this hook in this way, and you spend most of your time on your hook, This is how it's going to make someone actually want to spend more time on the pitch deck. And then all the other slides below it actually matter at that point. So the biggest thing I want you to do is I want you to spend all your time on your hook and spend all your time on what does my hook look like? Do I, from an external point of view, if they look to this without any information, would they actually feel connected to this and want to spend more time on it? As a general rule, you can use problem, why now, solution as the kind of 3, but just making sure when you're doing this, you're actually making them hooked and wanting to spend more time. So now you know what makes a great hook. Those first 3 slides are really what buy you the investor's attention for sure. But even if you're leading with that, if your slide titles are vague and generic, they're still just not going to be absorbing what you're telling them because they're still flicking through and they're not going through every single specific word and information that you're giving on your pitch deck. And this is a mistake I see in almost every pitch deck because founders just don't realize that VCs are scanning. They're not reading. They're not looking at every single word that you ever write. And because of that, what happens is you treat every slide like the investor is going to sit there and carefully go through every single word that you've written out. And they're going to spend as much time as you did to build it. And they're just not, right? Investors just don't have enough time for that. They don't think that pitch decks are that important for that either. And they just want to quickly get to an understanding if they should spend time with you. And they want to quickly decide if it's worth their time. So we come back to the flick test. What they're really doing is they're looking at your titles. And if the title doesn't make them want to spend time with you, they're just not going to do it. And if we come back to the pitch deck, right, what happens is, let's just use, for example, this one. When we're thinking about how an investor actually looks at a deck, the first thing they do is they look at the title, okay? So first thing they do. The first thing they do is they look at the title and they decide if it makes sense. Then they will most likely go away from that if you haven't convinced them via the title. Then they will move to potentially the extra wording that happens, or if we go scroll up here, right, it will be the number. And only then the third one, will they actually look at this information? And this is third as well. Will they look at the subheadline? So the first thing they'll do is they'll look at the title. And then if you're lucky, they'll do this in number 2, but not all the time. And these two, barely any time. And what you do is you'll spend so much time on these areas thinking, oh, I need to get everything perfect, when no one actually spends time on it. And the biggest problem when founders do this, if we go back to here, is when the title is just like problem or solution, it just tells you nothing. And now you actually have to read the whole slide, but you don't really want to. You feel disconjointed. It slows you down, and that's friction. And VCs don't want that work. And that's really why you need to make sure that you're creating a descriptive title that lets you scan and get it instantly. And the second thing from that is the story. When titles are generic, each slide feels like a disconnected block. You've got problem and then solution, then market. There's no thread pulling you through. There's no hook that's making me feel like I want to feel connected to this. I'm keeping going. I'm scrolling through. And that secondary friction from the descriptive title to the story aspect, that's what makes them feel like, oh, I don't want to do this. And then that's where they reject you, or they don't spend enough time on your pitch deck. Whereas if you fill them with descriptive titles, if they feel connected to what you're doing, that's what's going to allow them to move onwards. I saw this a lot with Daniel, for example. Before he worked on his deck lacked descriptive titles. It lacked a story. And when we looked at it from a DocSend point of view, we saw investors barely spent time on his deck. But once we improved this with the titles and we connected the story, and it felt like a full story that went from beginning to end, not only did his read time increase, but in the end he met more investors, and in the end raised his €4.5 million round in a much more structured way. And that came from making sure that he had descriptive titles and a story that actually made sense. But how do you do this? Well, like I've just shown you before, instead of using the problem, the solution as your slide titles, I want you to make them descriptive. One of the biggest things that you can do is, rather than building from the pitch deck, just write it out in words. Write out, okay, what are my titles and what do the slides want to be inside, and then writing the descriptive titles. You've got nothing else. You can only go by the titles. How does this tell a story, and how does it feel connected? And then secondary on that, I want you to make sure that you use connecting words. It's okay to use and, but, we, as you go through, because they're going to look at the titles and they're going to feel connected and they're going to nod along. And you want them to read it in sequence. And then lastly on that as well, when you're thinking about the descriptive, I want you to focus on outcomes instead of features. It's so important. Making sure that you're talking in what happens in terms of this got 10 times worse. We are increasing it by 41% rather than just talking about features. They need to feel connected to what's happening and that you're really going to be successful in what you're doing. So now your hook pulls them in and your titles are telling a story, but I see founders make one more mistake that undoes all of this. And what that is you overthink it and you try and cram everything in, because founders treat their deck like it's the whole business. You try and cram in every feature, every metric, every projection that you can. You think that if you leave something out, investors just won't get it. And the problem there is that it's just not true. The opposite usually happens, right? If you have a 30 slide deck monster, all the investors are going to be doing is they're going to have this massive information overload and they're not going to want to spend more time with you. And I want you to think about it like a movie trailer, right? That never shows you the whole film, because that's really what the pitch deck is. It's not the whole film. It's not going to make you get investment. All a pitch deck is a movie trailer that gets you into the first meeting, right? It gives you those best moments, the tension, the emotion, the one line that makes you think, I need to see this. And then it stops. That's what makes you, from a movie trailer, makes you say, I want to watch this film. I want to buy this ticket. As we're talking, right, the Dune 3 trailer just came out. I love Dune. And this came out and I was like so excited to watch the third film. And this is exactly the same. Your deck is the trailer. The meeting, the conversations you have after that is the movie. That's what's going to make you get investment. So you're not trying to make them feel like they get every single information that is possible. All you're trying to do is make them feel like they're missing out and that they want to take 30 minutes with you, which a lot of the time means omitting certain things within your deck. But how do you do this? Well, I want you to keep it tight. And here's exactly what that looks like. Up here, you can see there's 10 to 12 slides in this order. This is all you need. You don't have to go beyond this. Anyone that tells you to add extra things or omit certain things, just you're wasting your time. Just use this. If there's certain things that investor wants, like the financials or whatever it is, they can ask you for it. They're not going to say no to you because of it either. Just put these in, use this as your structure, create the descriptive titles, and each of these slides has a job. They flow into each other like a story, and anything that doesn't fit in here doesn't belong in your deck. Everything else belongs in the meeting. Everything else belongs in them wanting to spend more time with you and ask questions. And when you keep it this small, because investors want to learn more, they will more likely take a meeting with you, which is exactly what we want. So now you've got the slides, you've got the structure, but here's where I see most founders waste months of their life. You get stuck perfecting the deck instead of actually sending it out and doing the more important things that matter in your race. So you're wasting months on something that's not really helping you much anymore. Because decks have these massive diminishing returns. Once you get to 80%, of which I've just shown you with the slides, once you get to 80%, the improvements that you make is going to be so minuscule, and it's not really going to matter in you making sure that you're getting meetings or making sure that someone's actually going to invest into you. And from what I've seen is founders use the deck as a reason to procrastinate instead of actually fundraising. They just keep tweaking, redesigning, asking for more feedback, version 15, maybe changing the font, making this Frankenstein deck that everyone's telling them to all do these certain things, instead of actually working on their fundraise, instead of building their network, instead of understanding what happens in a meeting and understanding in the communication that brings them through it. And the truth is they're scared of rejection. They're scared that they're not ready to do the fundraise yet. And the pitch deck is this easy thing that they can spend some time on. And polishing the deck feels like progress without the risk of hearing no, without the risk of actually launching their raise. And it's something easy because they can feel like they're doing something. But the problem is that it's just not how fundraising works. If you spend all of your time on your pitch deck, you're never going to fundraise. No matter how many perfect pitch decks you have, it will never happen. I saw this so much, and a great example is Nusrat. She was spending so much time on her deck and not enough on what actually happened in meetings. When we first did a recorded call, in the 30 minutes something she had on that call, she spoke for about 20 to 25 minutes because she was just looking at her deck. She spent all her time on her deck. And if we didn't get work together, she would have stayed doing that. She would have stayed pushing investors away because she didn't work on what she was actually like in meetings and how she replied to investors and answered their questions. And only did we, when we changed that and we stopped making her spend all the time on the deck and actually improved how she was in meetings, how she did her structure of her fundraise, that allowed her to raise her round in the end. But it wasn't because she spent all of her time on the deck. And that's really what I want you to learn from this. You need to set a deadline. Give yourself a week to get to 80% of the deck and don't spend all of your time on it. Realize that there's other things you have to do. The feedback you get from real investors, what actual questions you're being asked, are you improving your network? These are the things that are going to matter so much more in your fundraise, and you spending all of your time trying to make the perfect deck is not going to be the reason why you get investment. And then because of that, your deck will probably get better anyway, because you're actually sending it out. You're understanding where people are getting confused, not just sitting on it and deciding that you think you can change the font and that's going to change anything. Because from what I've seen of the 120 plus rounds I've done, the founders who raise aren't the ones with perfect decks. They're the ones who sent it to 50 investors while you were still tweaking your font, and instead of spending all their time on their deck, they were actually preparing their fundraise that allowed them to get hundreds of meetings if they needed. Now, your deck is one part of the fundraising system. You also need to know how to find the right investors, run a process that creates momentum. If you want to learn the exact system to make you fundraise, then check out this video next.